Oh, the story of Jacob and the desert crossing and the blessing and the wrestling. Oh, I love this story. I love this story. Right? Isn't it a great story? Wrestling with God, wrestling with the man, right? And coming out okay on the other side and saying God was in it. God saw me and I saw God and it was good. And isn't that what we want on our journey, right? On our journey with God and with humanity, in whatever struggles we face, in whatever deserts we cross, in whatever fears we hold, in whatever relief we feel. That God will bless us, that others will bless us, that we will see God in it, and we will say thank you. That works for Jacob in this story, and it is a story to celebrate. It doesn't always work in our time and place, at least as I have experienced it living on the border with Arizona and Mexico. The good news for Jacob is that he makes it, and he crosses, and all of his fears are relieved, and he builds his family, and we'll talk more about the rest of his story next week. The bad news for those crossing our borders is many of them do not make it. And I want to tell you their story in light of Jacob's story. In 1994, two seemingly disparate things happened. The North American Free Trade Agreement was signed into law, and I'm not going to take a position on that agreement. I'm simply going to explain some of the consequences of that agreement on immigration. So in 1994, January 1st, the North American Free Trade Agreement went into law. About 5 or 6 months later, maybe 7, the Clinton administration authorized the expansion of the border wall. There already is one, by the way. We're arguing about whether or not to build one, but there already is one. So in 1994, here comes the border wall saying, don't come. Here comes NAFTA saying, we want trade to flow freely. And those two forces came about to bring about what is over 10,000 migrant deaths in the desert since that wall was created. The Mexican market flooded with U.S. corn. Good news for my corn-producing family in Kansas. Bad news for the subsistence farmers in the interior of Mexico. Could no longer earn a living growing corn. So what do? It's what all of us do. It's what Jacob did. It's what I did moving here to follow a job, right? Communities that had existed for generations in small communities in Mexico began migrating north. Well, why did they do that? Factories moved from North Carolina to north of the border. Bad news for North Carolina, good news for Mexico, maybe. So those who were internally displaced in Mexico found work in these factories along the border at the same time that the wall is being built along the same border. I can speak most specifically about the maquila factories in Agua Prieta, Mexico, which is just across the border of Douglas, Arizona. Having been there and visited there with a Presbyterian border ministry named Frontero de Cristo, and that is the source of your bulletin cover from that Presbyterian national ministry that our mission dollars helps to fund. So there, in the maquila factories, people who are used to growing corn are now figuring out how to make clothing And maybe that's okay for a while. In fact, Agua Prieta grows and becomes a flourishing border town. And lo and behold, a Presbyterian church gets founded there. Lily of the Valley Presbyterian Church. Isn't that great? There's a Presbyterian church in Douglas, Arizona, right across the border. And now we can have border crossing interactions among Presbyterians. And we may say this is good news, and we may celebrate that we are crossing borders, except what happens is that more and more people are coming in to Agua Prieta, and people who are used to having communities of maybe a couple hundred, maybe a couple thousand are now in a city bigger than Troy, and you get all of the urban problems that you might associate with that, and you look across the border through the slats of the wall, and there is an American teenager maybe 2 miles down the road, working at a Taco Bell, making more money than you, trying to feed a family of 6 or 10 or 11, as Jacob did. So what do, right? You cross the border, okay? There's another piece of the story that that happens a little bit later, is that the global migration of jobs continues, and your maquila factory shuts down and moves to Vietnam. So you are now internally displaced in your own country, and the job you moved for is gone, and now your only option is to cross. Where before it might have been a choice, now the choice is between continued unemployment and crossing, perhaps, to find something. The difference between Jacob's story and the story of the migrants I came to know in my time in Tucson is that Jacob crossed with his entire family, and my experience was that it was usually a father who went first to find some relative in the United States, often a farm worker or somebody employed illegally in a business in the United States where they could get in undercover. The problem with that, well, there's many problems with that, but this is where the consequences of NAFTA and the building of the border law connect into 10,000 migrant deaths that we know of in the desert. The border wall in 1994, and this again was the Clinton administration, so it's bipartisan. We can blame one party or the other, but it's been both. The border wall was intentionally designed to divert migrants into the most dangerous parts of the desert. Intentionally. And I've walked those trails, and let me tell you, I would not want to do so without help. We go from 1993, where no migrants die in the desert, to 1994, where 300 die. And all of a sudden, those Presbyterian churches on both sides of the border that began as simply joyous relationships among sister and brother Christians have a crisis of conscience. We know each other. In fact, we used to cross this border without a problem at all. Just go down the street from Douglas to Agua Prieta, and now there's this massive wall, and now people are dying. And yes, some of them are drug smugglers, and some of them are very dangerous, but most of them aren't. Most of them are dads like Jacob, kids like Reuben and the rest of his brothers, like Greg and George, like Rachel and Leah. They're crossing the desert, and they're dying. So what did good thinking, good loving, God-loving Presbyterians do? They took out a map and they said, where are they dying? We can't fix the policy. We can't tear down the wall, or we don't think we can. But we can put water and food and nurses and those who can assist migrants in those places where there are the most deaths. So that's what they did. A group called Humane Borders put out water stations, big, huge jugs of water where people could drink in the hottest, most dangerous parts of the desert, and people will go out and fill the water jugs. The Good Samaritans will round up nurses to go out on the trails and literally call out in Spanish, "Necesitas agua, necesitas ayuda," and often would find people who could barely walk because their feet were so damaged. Often those people would ask the assistants to take them to Border Patrol. They knew that they were dying and needed to go back home. There was no other option. Sometimes they would just be assisted and continue on the journey. It was illegal for humanitarian aid workers to do anything but feed, clothe, offer medical treatment. It was illegal to transport, illegal to do anything but that, but some did. Some took the risk to drive them, even knowing that Border Patrol checkpoints would catch them often. This is what Presbyterians have done for how many years now? 23? It has not worked in the sense that hearts and minds have changed about the border wall, and hearts and minds have changed about immigration policy, and hearts and minds have changed about how we ensure a fair and equitable economic system, or even that we figured out how to do it. The difference in the story of, or what has changed, is that beginning in 2017, these humanitarians who would fill up water tanks and offer food and nursing and even create some bases out in the desert to go out and look for people who needed help. What has changed is that they have now been targeted by Border Patrol. That migrants now coming to these camps of humanitarian workers are now being raided. That Presbyterians who are offering water and food and care are now becoming backdoor Border Patrol agents. And so they don't know what to do next. The other thing that has changed is that in the first 7 months of 2017, there's been a 20% rise in desert crossing deaths. It's getting worse, not better. Jacob is wrestling with the man in the desert and wrestling with God, and the people of God are wrestling back, and we're losing. So how do we take that to our scripture? How do we take that to our God and say, can you please give us a blessing? Or rather them, a blessing? Is there a way we can be a blessing to those who are demanding dignity? Saying, I too am God's beloved child. Will you not see me? What does this story bring to us who are crying out? I have a couple of thoughts, none of which is 100% sufficient, but all of which will continue our wrestling with God in this journey of immigration and the Bible. The first is an honest lament. This is not the will of God, period. Crying out, exposing. This is not the will of God, period. The second thing we do is pray. Pray that hearts and minds will change, that justice will roll down like waters, that Jacob will receive a blessing once this long, dark night has ended, and that we will be agents of that blessing through our mission giving, through our advocacy, through our education. What else do? We bless. We bless in our own midst the inherent worth and dignity of the migrant. We claim that inherent worth and dignity as our own because Jacob's story is the story of our ancestor, because we are the direct descendants, either literally in our own generational experience or biblically in the experience of Christianity. We are descendants of the migrant who makes it. And so we advocate always for the migrant who doesn't, and for the family of the migrant who doesn't. What else do? We trust. I don't know, I don't always trust, but here I go. We trust that God is about the business of resurrection, that God hears the cries of unjust suffering deep in the desert of the U.S.-Mexico border, that God is somehow, some way, even now, working overtime to bring all things together for good, and please God, let this be the darkness just before the dawn. What do we do, friends, when Jacob is wrestling with God in the desert, wrestling with the man in the desert, and it's midnight, and light and dawn seems a long way off? Well, we wrestle with him. And so it will be. As we come to this table, we make the commitment that Jacob is not alone in that desert, that we are not alone in whatever desert we find ourselves in, that God is still with us and we are still working. And that dawn will come and we will say, God has been in it. God has seen it. We have seen God, and we have overcome. May that day come soon. Amen.